I turned around to look at the bow of the boat, and to my puzzlement I couldn't locate Gale. I heard a cry by the same time I spotted an object speeding downriver. Gale was desperately trying to swim upriver to the boat as the river powered her downstream. By the time she started to scream, I was already running up the length of the boat. By the time I dove into the water, she was 50 yards downstream and sunk out of sight from an undertow. Even as I cringed from the numbing cold of the water, I knew I made the right decision to dive in after her. If Gale had the presence of mind, she wouldn't have fought so hard to swim upstream, but instead used her efforts to swim downstream to the bank where she could have waded out of the water. Instead, she was panicking like most people would and sought to return to a safe haven. I couldn't have gotten the anchors up in time and start the boat to catch up to her. It was essential that I kept her in sight as best I could. I started swimming as fast as I could downstream. I heard her yell again, which meant the undertow had released her, and she had made her way to the surface. I didn't see, but I knew she was trying desperately to get to me. The problem was she was quickly tiring, and eventually she would go into an undertow that she would not be able to power her way back to the surface, where she would collide with a snag and be injured and not be able to save herself. I had to get to her as quickly as I could. I reached the area of the undertow that sucked her under and felt it try to draw me to doom. The difference being that I was speeding along on purpose allowed me to quickly draw away from its grasp. Slowly, ever so slowly, I gained ground as her voice weakened. Still, I knifed through the water to catch up to her. I was in mid-stroke when an unidentified snag rammed into my torso. It caused me to gasp from the pain, and I sucked in the muddy river water and sputtered it back out as best I could. I had to ignore the pain as I continued to stroke toward Gale. 30 feet, 20 feet. She disappeared again and thankfully came back up. 15 feet, 10, 5. I saw that last remaining looks of desperation on her face before she submitted to the will of nature. 3, 2, 1. Her arms blindly flailed to me, and her hands snatched away to grasp me. Now, I would have to tend to a new danger of Gale unwittingly clinching to me and riding us both to our deaths. I waited for the right moment and reached out and jerked her hair. I was using the hand on my injured side, so the extra effort shot pain throughout my body, but I continued to hold on. Luckily, the pain I was causing Gale was making her grab my arm to alleviate tugging on her hair. As long as she continued to do that, we had a chance. As I slowly guided us closer to the bank, I had the incongruous thought that finally I was touching the red flames of those auburn tresses. I quickly dispelled that notion as we approached near a large sandbar. I continued to fight to get us away from the sway of the river. Then my knee bumped into sand. I started to scramble upright. When I let go of Gale, she panicked again and tried to grab me before she realized land was underfoot. We both crawled up the sandbar, crying, gasping for breath, shivering from the cold, collapsing into the wet sand to try to recover. I felt the hard muscle spasms and the numbing of my fingers and toes. I crawled up the bank, ignoring the pleas of Gale. I grabbed as much of the dry, brittle pine straws and oak leaves as I could from the peninsula of the sandbar. I stumbled back to Gale and shielding it away from the wind as best I could. I dug out my Zippo lighter to desperately try to summon the strength and dexterity to light a fire. The onset of hypothermia was evident in both of us. Unless I could quickly provide warmth, our metabolism would shut down and we would both die on that miserable little sandbar. I prayed hard as my thumb caused the rotation of the wheel of the lighter. Would it ignite? Had the immersion contaminated the lighter fluid? Would this be my final act of desperation? Would I ever see my children again? The wheel of the old metal-encased lighter turned like the wheel of fate, determining our fortune. I watched as the first sparks flew about, and then the weak flame appeared in the October night. I sobbed as I held it to the dry tinder, willing it catch fire. Slowly, the flame crept among the leaves, growing stronger and brighter. I fed more leaves for the flame to consume as it built and started to smoke. I willed myself to leave and scramble for another load of precious straws and leaves. Then another and another. I told Gale to strip out of her wet clothes as I made another run to the bank. Now I picked up small dried twigs to feed to the fire. When I returned to throw them on the fire, I noticed Gale had not complied with my order. Again, I told her to undress as I went back for another armload of leaves to persuade the fire to escalate to the ignition point of the wood I had placed on it. as I dumped the leaves on the fire and it smoldered momentarily. I angrily shook her and told her to get out of her wet clothes before she died. That snapped her awake, and once again I saw the animosity light in her eyes. Good. The hate will keep you alive, I thought. I went to grab bigger branches as Gail stood to her knees and began to strip out of the cold, heavy, wet sodden sweatshirt. I wished I had the opportunity to relish that sight, but I remained busy alternating carrying woods and leaves to the fire. I noticed she had turned away from me as she fumbled for the snap of her jeans. Still, the sight of her bare back was enticing as she struggled out of the legs of the jeans. By the next trip, her bra and panties had amassed on the pile of clothes, and she huddled modestly before the fire as the warmth returned to her. I now had enough of a stockpile that I warranted it was safe for me to undress. Ignoring propriety, I shivered as I stripped naked before Gail. Did she sneak a peek at me? I didn't notice, and I didn't care. We were two islands of shivering humanity huddled around a campfire, gaining warmth as though we were Neanderthals in the Ice Age. As our bodies slowly came back from the brink of death, I noticed Gail began to quietly cry. I tried to ignore her vulnerability and allow her the fiction of privacy as the implication of our escape became more pronounced. Her quiet sobs turned into weeping and soon escalated into full-scale hysteria. I couldn't stand by anymore. I went to her and sat by her and forced her to accept my hug. I continued to hold her as she wailed into the frosty night. There was not an iota of sexuality in my gesture. We were just two primitive beings stripped of the veneer of civilization, trying to cope in a harsh, unfeeling world. She buried her head against me, and I caressed her just to connect to her, just to let her know I was there to comfort her. She continued to accept me as the flame continued to warm us. Her crying convulsions ebbed, and still she remained in my arms. Then she looked at me and quietly said, "Thank you." And with that, the magic spell was broken, and we became uncomfortable in our nakedness as I went back to my initial spot of neutrality. We both continued to stare into the fire from our respective positions. I broke the silence to tell her I would get some wood to put her clothes out to dry. As I got up, she averted her gaze away. When I returned with some suitable wood, I dumped it close to her and announced I was going farther into the bank for more wood. She recognized this as my effort to tell her I wouldn't invade on her privacy as she prepared her clothes. I waited as long as I could stand being away from the fire, and then I returned. To my surprise, she had also lined out my clothes to dry as well. I quietly thanked her as again we averted away from each other. It must have looked comical from anyone else's perspective. Here we were, grown adults, away from all the world, sharing a life or death experience, and we both couldn't overcome the awkwardness of simply looking at each other. It was though we both mutually agreed that we did not have permission to do so. So we waited as our clothes dried. Both of us would experimentally test our clothes for dryness by reaching out and touching them. As the garments finally dried, we would turn away from each other and quickly dress. At long last, the heavier garments, the jeans and sweatshirts, dried sufficiently to put on. Once we were both finally dressed, it was time for our discussion. "Gail, we have to decide what we are going to do. Here are the obvious facts. We are stranded on the bank of the river. No one knows our predicament. We have no way to summon help since both our phones are fried from our swim. The only person that would miss us is your grandfather, and he won't be back home till tomorrow. Our options are, we remain on the bank and hope a boat rescues us, or Robert returns and initiates a search for us when he misses us." I paused and continued, "Or I could leave you here with enough firewood, walk through the woods back upstream and get the boat and come down and get you. What would you like me to do, Gail?" Without hesitation, she stated she wanted to get back home as quickly as possible. I had expected that answer. Everyone would have answered the same way without thinking of the implications and consequences of that action. I would have to navigate the bank of the river upstream without light, shod only in tennis shoes among the sharp and knobby roots waiting to trip me, into the unforeseen briars and brush waiting to trap me. I would have to stumble into the chill of the October night and grope forward until I came to our boat and face one last test. I would have to voluntarily dive back in that frigid water and climb back into the boat, start it up, and in the cold, chill air pilot the boat down to the sandbar to rescue Gail. I went into the woods a last time to gather firewood, quick, burning pine and longer, sustaining oak to tide Gale over. I told Gale that if for whatever reason I did not come back to stay with the fire and keep it burning, when it became daylight, chances were a boat would appear that she could hail to her rescue. I told her I would follow the contours of the bank, so I should remain in earshot of any potential rescuers. As I began to leave, Gale threw herself at me in an impulsive hug. God, I wanted to stay there locked into her arms, but I had made a promise and I had to fulfill it. I walked away from her and quickly was in uncharted territory as my eyes tried to adjust to the night. I walked with arms outstretched before me to warn me of any peril. I shuffled my feet slowly among all the brush and brambles scratching me. Often I would reach an impasse of impregnable brush and have to navigate around it to return to my course. Often I would fall, each time racking my ribs in pain from my colliding with the unknown object in the river. I could tell in the dim moonlight where the river ran below me, inviting me once again to fall into its trap. I lost all sense of time as my journey continued, shivering in the cold. How had we traveled so far in the rapid current of the river? A mile? 5 miles? More? I began to despair from not finding the boat. I knew every second there was Gale worried alone in the woods, and that gave me fresh incentive to continue. I rounded a rise in the bank, and there it finally was, a dark silhouette silently bobbing in the river. I mentally began to prepare myself for that god-awful cold I would have to endure again as I walked to the final steps upstream that would ensure that I would drift to the boat. Summoning up the last vestige of my courage before I once and finally came to my senses, I jumped into the river for the second time voluntarily that evening. The bone-chilling cold again introduced itself to my body. Suffering from another relapse, I could sense my body quickly shutting down. I would not have near the time as I had initially to respond. As the cold cramped my fingers, I reached and grasped the boat ladder at the starboard side of the pontoon. Somehow I managed to climb aboard and hurried to start the engine. The trustworthy mercury outboard fired up as I jumped to the toolbox and groped for the flashlight and knife that were among the items stored. Turning the light on, I went to each anchor line and quickly cut through them, and suddenly we were adrift. I ran to the cockpit and moved the throttle forward for maximum speed as I turned on the navigational lights and entered the main channel, assured I would not run aground or into any unseen hazard. I felt the encroaching freeze working against me as the wind chill kept lowering my body temperature, dangerously close to the point of no return. I squinted, peering in the dark, looking for signs of the campfire. There, that orange pinprick. Could it be? I saw the form of a human dancing, trying to wave me down. I shut off the throttle and killed the engine and allowed the momentum of the boat to wedge to a stop on the sandbar. The welcoming cheers from Gale suddenly stopped as she saw my condition. It finally dawned on her what I had undergone, and she rushed to assist me to get me close to the fire. She threw every bit of wood on the fire, and the conflagration lit up a wide berth around the sandbar. Then she undressed me and cursed me at the same time as she cried, seeing the scratches and bruises all over my body. I went into the fetal position around the fire, and mercifully I passed out, still hearing her cuss me for being a fool. When I came back to the world, I was still in the fetal position. The fire was still roaring. A new stockpile of wood was on hand, and once again my clothes were being dried from the heat of the fire, and Gale was behind me, forming her body against my back to provide body heat. I groggily asked her how long I was out, and she replied it wasn't important. I just needed to rest and remain warm. So we remained on the ground in that position, and of all the positions I had fantasized myself with Gale since I first met her, this was one I hadn't figured on. She began apologizing profusely to me. Had she only thought about what I had to do, she would have never asked me to do it. I told her to shut up. No one forced a gun to my head to do it. We remained in that position until I saw my clothes steaming and smoldering from the heat. Gale quickly got up and readjusted the clothes to complete drying, and then went back to her former position. I began to think I could learn to enjoy this position. In time she got up and said my clothes were dry, and then it was her turn to walk into the woods and allow me to dress alone. I started up the boat, and at that signal she reappeared into view. Even though there was a large barrier of sand from any flammable material, I ordered Gale to help me douse the fire with sand. I felt a little sad as the last dying ember disappeared from sight from the life-sustaining fire that had been there. As I threw the boat into reverse and turned on the navigation lights again, Gail walked in front of me and half sat, half stood at the captain's chair at the cockpit. I recognized that we would continue to share body heat as we made our way to the marina we had launched at early that morning. When she got cold from shielding me, Gail would retreat behind me until she was ready to return to the front. The marina appeared across the river, and I crossed the channel and entered its harbor. I was in no shape to load the boat onto the trailer and transport it out. I found an unoccupied slip and I tied the boat off and killed the engine. The marina was deserted at the late hour. If anyone took offense, they could call the Coast Guard to run the registration number and contact Robert, who in turn would contact me. We limped to my truck, and I turned it on and immediately turned on the heat to full. As it permeated through the cab, I saw a large smile of gratitude on Gail's face as we began the final miles to her house. We still hadn't spoken much since the marina, and I started getting drowsy from the heat. I asked her to start talking to keep me awake. Then I just listened to that soft, melodious voice for the first time, absent the acrid acerbic venom I was used to. The miles for once passed by too quickly as we arrived at her house. I had mixed emotions as I stopped in her drive. Happiness that I had got her home after such a harrowing experience. Sadness that she was leaving me, and probably tomorrow our temporary truce would be null, and we would be back in our private little Cold War. Anxiety for thinking I had another 20 minutes on the road before I collapsed in my trailer. Chances were good I would fall asleep behind the wheel. She got out and I thought she was going to bid me good night. Instead, she looked at me and said, "Don't even think you are going anywhere." She turned around to the house and I meekly obeyed her and got out of the truck to follow her to the house. Once inside, she commanded me to build a fire in their fireplace. "I know you can do that. I've seen you in action." She walked into the kitchen, and I heard clattering going on as I prepared to light the fire. I tried to use my Zippo lighter, but it failed to ignite. I reflected on what a whim our lives were balanced as I struck on one of the long-stemmed matches Robert used to set the fire. In a matter of minutes, the flames merrily licked up to start feeding on the seasoned oak that Robert had in his tinderbox that I used in the fireplace. Gail came out with 2 oversized ceramic mugs steaming away. "I'm afraid I can only offer you chicken noodle soup out of the Canute. Next time I promise you it will be homemade," she explained as put the mugs down on the coffee table and went to the closet in the hallway and got out some thick woolen blankets. She told me to sit down on the sofa. I looked at my dirty, bloody, sand-gritted clothes and hesitated. "Oh, for God's sakes, John, it's just a couch. I'll get it cleaned." Again, I obeyed as I realized for the first time she used my name, and she wrapped a blanket around me and handed me one of the mugs. Then she wrapped herself in the other blanket and slowly sipped on her mug of soup. She used the remote to kill the lights, and so we sat together side by side, staring into the fire in the darkened den, sipping away at our soup. I placed my empty mug back on the coffee table, and she did likewise. We continued to stare into the fire, and I became mesmerized by the ocean of shifting hues of orange as the embers of the logs heated and cooled at various points. It reminded me of Gail's hair. Atop the yellow flames continued to burn into the logs. Gail shifted and placed her head against my shoulder. We remained like that for a long time when she finally spoke. In a soft, timid voice she began, still looking straight into the fire, "I'm going to tell you a story. I don't want you to interrupt. I don't want you to stop me. I don't want you to say anything until I've finished." She continued, "About 2 months before I graduated, I met this guy from school and started dating him. He looked a lot like you. Tall, brown hair, cute smile, green eyes. I was getting real attached to him, but I still wanted to make sure he was the one. So, I kept stalling him whenever he started talking about taking it to the next level. He made the noise of saying he understood, but still he kept pushing and pushing at me." Gail paused and moved her hand to my blanket-covered bicep for support before she continued. "Graduation day. We celebrated by going out that evening to an expensive restaurant. I excused myself to go to the restroom. When I got back to the table, an expensive bottle of wine was uncorked. 'Only the best was good enough for me,' he said. He raised his wine flute and gave me a toast. 'To us,' he declared, 'may we always be happy.' I finished off my wine flute and returned his dazzling smile and relished what my future would hold. 6 hours later, I was being transported to the hospital by ambulance. My roommates had made it home and found me sprawled on the living room floor. My dress had been ripped to expose my breasts, which were covered with bruises and bite marks. When my bra was broken, it caused a large friction burn on my ribcage. When they couldn't wake me, they called 911. The police arrived about the same time the ambulance did. When I got to the hospital, they ordered a toxicology screen and determined I was under the influence of Rohypnol, the data salt drug. I was shocked by Gail's revelation as she continued to dredge up the trauma. They also performed a kit exam which concluded that I had indeed had sex and DNA was extracted from the sperm collected from my vagina. Because there was no way to tell whether I had been infected with anything, I was prescribed an entire plethora of prescription medications to make sure I was okay. In fact, I'm still required to take some pills and go in for checkups. The detective that investigated my case kept asking for the perpetrator's name. He knew I was shielding him. Apparently, it isn't that unusual for a woman to run and hide and pretend it didn't happen or that it was their fault it happened. The detective told me if I changed my mind and decided to cooperate to give him a call. I went home, and for the first day, I wore my brand of shame. My maroon Texas A&M shirt would serve as my scarlet letter, a remembrance of my connection with my abuser. Each day, I would die a little more and wear my shame for the world to see. But you understand, they couldn't see. All they saw was a woman with a shirt with a college logo. So it also served as my shield. My shield from the revelation that I had been treated as a piece of meat and thrown away. I wanted her to stop. I wanted her to not experience the horror again as she continued to lance deeper into her wounded psyche, drawing out the emotional pus. Her hand was now painfully clenching my bicep as I allowed her to continue. I withdrew from my friends one by one, as they all argued for me to go to counseling or tell the police or this or that. I still managed to draw deeper into my hell, each day wearing that damn brand, each day hating myself. I decided I would continue to retreat. I called my grandfather and asked if I could stay with him. Of course he said yes, and so I came down and I could forget a little bit of my shame as I enjoyed the beauty of the land. He showed me again the Red River, and the kernel of my idea drew back from a long ago lecture in history, and I began doing some research, and I thought that by committing to this project I could abate the shame a little more. Then my grandfather suggested to have you included. I knew we would need help to pull this off, so I was okay with meeting you. Until I saw who you reminded me of, and then I was not. Each day, I had to endure the daily torture of wearing that logo and seeing you. Each day, I kept trying to find a way to make you irrelevant and unneeded, so you would go away and not bother me anymore. Her voice rose in pitch as she concluded her statement. I suppose I would still be looking for a way to get rid of you if I hadn't tripped over my own damn foot and fell overboard. She started to cry again, recalling the experience. Oh God, I was so afraid and alone and cold. That numbing cold as I tried to swim back to the boat and saw you diving in. Then something dragged me under the water, and then I was back on the surface gulping air and trying to get to you. But it felt like I was getting away from you. Everything was a blur as you grabbed my hair. I wanted to grab onto you so you would save me, but the pain made me grab your hand so you would release my hair. Then you pushed me onto the sandbar, and now the chilly air paralyzed me. All I could do was watch as you built the fire and warmth slowly returned to me. Then you ordered me out of my clothes, and I had another flashback, and I wasn't going to obey you. Then you yelled at me, and I knew if I didn't take off my clothes, you would rip them off me, and then assaulted me. And I knew I had no choice. So I sat there paralyzed, waiting for you to dominate and abuse me. Then I sat huddling as you approached and began stripping, and then you sat down and finally began to warm yourself. Each second gave me new hope that I would be okay, and then I had a moment of serendipity when I realized you were you and not my monster from the past. I started to feel ashamed of everything I projected on you, and I started crying, and you came over to me naked. You sat right next to me and cradled me in your arms, and I felt protected. An hour before our mishap, if you had touched me, I would have screamed at you. Now we were both naked, and I felt safe in your arms, and I wonder why it took me this long to realize my mistake. Once again, Gail had devolved into full-blown weeping, and I managed to get my arm out of the blanket and around her, and I tried to comfort her and held her silently as the fire continued to die out. When I woke up, I felt her stirring awake as well, and we both saw the sight of an unbelieving Robert looking down at us. I wouldn't believe this if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Can someone tell me what the hell our boat is doing in the marina? And why wouldn't either of you answer your phones? Gail and I untangled and painfully stood up. Gail looked at me expectantly. I knew what she was asking. You have to tell him. I'm going to go get our boat, and I'll come right back and then we will decide what to do. As I left, Gail and Robert were walking to the kitchen table to tell him all the secrets. I managed to placate the irate owner of the marina with an apology and a $100 donation, which included the staff loading the boat onto my trailer for me. When I got back to Robert's, he was still sitting at the kitchen table, pale and trying to digest the events. I asked where Gail was, and he told me she was taking a shower. We started discussing things from our perspective when Gail appeared before us. "No," I shouted. "You are through paying a penance you don't owe. Get upstairs and put anything else on but that." Gail was shocked at my reaction, seeing her still donning her college logo, still wearing her badge of shame. As far as I was concerned, that was over. She came down hesitantly, wearing a flowery blouse that complimented her. I reacted by opening my arms, and she smiled and rushed to hug me. Damn, my ribs still hurts. Then she looked at Robert, and he invited her into his arms, and he hugged her for a long time. Then he insisted on taking us to the hospital to be checked over. It turned out my ribs were severely bruised and were wrapped tight to mend. Various cuts were cleaned and prescriptions ranging from antiseptics to painkillers were prescribed. Luckily, other than suffering from exposure, Gail had no residual physical injuries. We made plans to drive to College Station the next day. Gail went into the police station escorted by us and gave a complete statement to the assigned detective naming the culprit. Then we met with Gail's roommates, and they heard the story in its entirety. They all rushed to show the love and affection they had for their friend. I was hugged as well, and I knew that I would have to take a few extra painkillers to compensate for the emotions these women showed in their hugs. Gail asked if her friends could get her the name of a therapist that lived close to her grandfather. 10 phones appeared simultaneously to find her that information. Since Robert had to drive us, I was allowed the front passenger seat for my comfort. Gail continued to huddle over me and asked how I was doing on the drive. When we got back to Robert's house, she insisted that I stay in the spare guest room. I had no business staying in that small trailer with no one to look after me, she said. I couldn't wait for her to say something like that in front of my grandmother. Naturally, they got along great when they met for the first time. Gail offered to drive me to the visitation since I was still on the painkillers and had no business behind the wheel. It was a welcome change of pace to have someone to talk to on the drive, and for that awful hour of anticipation. By November, I was off the painkillers, but Gail still wanted to come with me. So again, she served as a welcome distraction to my anguish. In December, after the fruitless visit, she helped load up the gifts back into my truck. I had purchased the items on the off chance they would appear. Gail suggested taking the gifts to a charity to be distributed to a needy family. Things were rolling along for Gail. Her assaulters had been arrested, and a warrant was served forcing him to provide his DNA. It was an exact match. Another warrant was served to search his phone. He had videotaped the entire disgusting act on his phone. He and his attorney had decided that rather than stall, they would ask for a quick trial. The reason being that, given Gail initial reluctance to cooperate, she would be more likely to fold from testifying now rather than having a year to prepare. She calmly appeared on the witness stand and described in detail the horror she underwent. The jury came back in less than an hour and gave him the maximum sentence on every charge. The bailiff told me that they would have been back quicker, but they were trying to find a way to give him even more time than allowed. Things moved at a comfortable pace with our relationship. I was asked to participate in some of Gail's sessions, and I made it be known that I would do whatever I needed to do to help Gail. The therapist assured me that Gail was already aware of that. So the months passed until we were in late spring, and Gail and I were back on the Red River recovering the data we had originally lost. I insisted that she wore a life jacket the entire trip. She wouldn't tell me what were in the large boxes in the stern that Robert had loaded on the boat. As we approached that fateful spot where she fell in back in October, she told me she changed her mind and wanted to go to our sandbar. I complied, and we landed there, and she hopped off and asked me if I would build her a fire. I went and got some old wood and took out my refurbished Zippo lighter and soon had a fire going on the exact spot as before. Then she asked that I start unloading the items in the boxes. First, I took out a tent, so I went and constructed it where we had huddled together. Then there was an air mattress with an electrical blower, so I had it plugged up on a power converter on the boat, and soon it was filled with air. I placed it inside the tent along with the sleeping bag for two. The food fare was atypical campfire food: hot dogs and marshmallows and sodas and bottled water, and a bottle of champagne chilling in the ice cooler. We sat by each other enjoying the simple pleasure of our outing as we talked and interacted with a familiarity that had been alien to both of us the previous fall. I reached over and gently moved my hand through her gorgeous auburn curls. She reminded me that I had been a lot rougher with her the first time I did that on the sandbar. I told her I was sorry and asked how I could make it up to her. She told me I could kiss her. I leaned in and softly kissed her. As I slowly broke away from the kiss, she commanded another one and another, and another. Our hands began to explore each other's body, and I enjoyed the sensation of hearing her coo from my caresses. When she was ready, she stripped off her t-shirt, and I saw her full bosom jiggling as she threw the shirt aside in the approximate area where the clothes had dried. That led to a cascade of clothes being shed and thrown in a mutual pile. Acknowledging a practical desire for comfort, I spread the oversized picnic blanket over the sand and laid beside the most beautiful creature I had ever seen. Her flawless alabaster skin, her deep blue eyes like sapphires, those luscious full lips begging to be kissed. Hell, her entire body deserved to be kissed, and I proceeded to do so from the top of her head all the way down to her toes. Of course, some areas got more attention than others, but I figured after 40 or 50 years it would all even out. Now, there was a particular area I intended to mine for treasure, and I soon directed all my attention there. Kissing all around, I advanced up until I was looking directly into her eyes as I kissed her. She rocked me to a quick orgasm and collapsed on my chest, purring her pleasure. We fell asleep like that. I was awakened in the middle of the night looking at a sea of stars in the moonless night. Gail was quietly riding me again in the dark, and I could sense her body outline as it blocked out the view of the stars. I nuzzled against her head and whispered at her to look at the stars as we rocked once again to completion. And once again we drifted into the tranquility of the night. Early in the dawn I woke and saw a heavy fog blanketing us in a sea of light gray clouds. I looked at my lover peacefully slumbering and I lightly kissed her. A faint smile appeared on her face as she went through a series of motions before she finally opened her eyes, and a bigger smile appeared as she kissed me again. We were soon making love again. This time I was sitting on the sand and Gail was sprawled in my lap as we quietly rocked away. Another blanket covered us as we became lost into our rhythm. She got up and spread her arms apart, holding onto the blanket as though she was an Earth Mother displaying all her finery for the world to see. The world consisting only of me, as we were still encapsulated in our small world of gray. I watched her walk to the edge of the sandbar to the safe eddy of water beside the bank. She carefully waded into the water and continued to acclimate to it, sinking more of her body into the still water. I had gotten out the iron skillet and placed it on the fire I had prompted again. Rashers of bacon were soon ready as I collected them out of the skillet and substituted eggs to be cooked. She must have sensed the food was ready because she slowly walked out of the water to me, and suddenly my hunger was for something else as I watched a goddess of nature approach me. She touched my cheek and promised me she would sate me. But first, we would eat. She fulfilled her promise, and afterwards we walked hand in hand into the water and gently bathed each other. By mutual consent, we began dressing as the fog began to burn off, leaving us in warm, glowing sunlight. I packed up everything, including the tent, an air mattress, and sleeping bag that we never got to use. Well, that would serve as an excuse for another trip, I thought as we motored back to our launch ramp. Things progressed along nicely until I started getting unsolicited messages from Stella, my ex-wife. As I said at the beginning, I was adamant not to put myself in a position where she had any power over me, so I ignored everything. Finally, I got a call from my divorce attorney saying that Stella wanted to see me about a proposition. He assured me that meeting her in his office would not violate any court order in effect. I asked Gail what she thought, and she said I might as well find out what it was Stella wanted to talk about. So that is why I found myself in my lawyer's conference room when the door opened and Stella walked into the room. The last few years had not been kind to her. I heard after her marriage, Ted had impregnated her with twins. I guess tending to 4 children was a little too much for Stella from the extra weight on her frame, bags around her eyes, frown lines on her face. Stella sat down and asked me how I was doing. I decided, screw this. I wasn't going to idly chit-chat with her. What the hell do you want, Stella? She was thrown off balance and started stammering why she was there. I couldn't make any sense from her and told her to stop talking in her native tongue of which and start speaking English or I would leave. She closed her eyes and said, "How would you like to have the children?" "Okay, Stella, what is the catch?" I asked warily. "There is no catch, John. If you want to have the children, I will have custody awarded to you, and I will have visitation." "All right, Stella," I responded. "You better explain to me why you are doing this at this stage of the game." She snapped back, "Look, do you want the children or not? Listen, witch, before I decide to do this, you are going to answer some questions. First, I don't care why you divorced me, but why did you go nuclear on me telling all those lies about hurting you and the kids?" She sighed. "That day you almost caught us embarrassed, Ted. All he could think about was you telling the whole city how he ran off from you. He decided that to take me and the children away from you would be your just desserts. Then it wasn't good enough. Ted wanted more revenge. So I placed that call to have you meet me when you got arrested. That placated him for a little while. Then he decided to turn the children against you by buying them everything under the sun and grant all their wishes. Presto, Ted had an instant family and you were left with nothing. Okay, Stella, now the real reason why you want to give me custody." Stella looked like she was going to cry. "When I got pregnant with the twins, Ted shifted his affection from Carol and Stephen to his kids. I kept begging him to continue to love them, but he started seeing his raising your children was a form of cucking him, and he resented it." Stella began sniffing and looked at the box of tissues near me. Screw her. If she wanted a tissue, she can get her 304 bum up and get one. I continued to wait. Stephen and Carol both reacted badly to Ted's rejection. All they knew was they used to get everything, and now their half-brothers are being spoiled with Ted's time and money. Stephen is running with a bad crowd, and Carol is claiming she has a 22-years-old boyfriend. If you don't take them, John, they are going to be totally lost. I tried to imagine my 15-years-old son, Stephen, as a juvenile delinquent, and then my 13-years-old daughter, Carol, with an adult boyfriend. I thought back on the beautiful children they were. What the hell had happened to them? I knew the answer. They had served as a prize in the game of divorce, and once Stella and Ted had won, they had shifted their attention elsewhere, confusing Stephen and Carol. And the kids were lashing out for attention in a desperate attempt to find love. Stella, why now? You've kept them from me for 5 years. Why the big change of heart? She looked to the floor and said, "I'm pregnant again." Well, don't that beat all? For a witch that complained about me wanting to keep her barefooted, pregnant, and in the kitchen. She was doing a stellar job winding right back into that position. When I asked her when she wanted for the custody change to take effect, she continued to look away from me and said immediately. I knew right then she would never make a single visitation to see Stephen or Carol. She was planning to abandon them just as she had abandoned me. I just felt utter disgust from this creature I couldn't even recognize anymore. I wanted to get away, take a shower, and then just spend the rest of the day in Gail's arms. We discussed the final logistics of changing the custody by mutual decree. When we finished, we both stood up from the table. Stella hesitated as though she expected me to come over and hug her. When I didn't, she stuck her hand out for me to shake. I just continued to stare at her until she dropped her hand and walked out the door. The mutual decree for changing custody sailed through the court without any problem. Nobody raised the issue that the alleged child abuser now had custody. The exchange took place at the site of my visitations. I watched 2 sullen kids enter the room with their suitcases packed with their belongings. I thought what a crime it had been to have stolen 5 years of seeing my children grow up. I went to hug them, and neither seemed too enthusiastic over that. I realized that I would also have to overcome 5 years of constant denigration by Stella and Ted about me. This would not be cured overnight. As I loaded up the vehicle with their luggage, Stephen fished a cigarette out of a pack and lit it up. I reached out and snatched it out of his mouth and ground it under my foot. When you are an adult, you can smoke all you want, but Right now you are living under my rules." I made him give me the pack and I threw them away as he sneered at me. Then Carol said, "I thought Mom was a witch." Before she knew what was happening, she found herself across my laps receiving licks. "Get this straight, you two. You will respect your mother at all times in front of me." I allowed Carol to get up, and the shock of having been disciplined for the first time in 5 years had stunned her. She and Stephen meekly got in the truck, wondering what was going to happen next. I told them that when we got home, they would be meeting someone very special in my life. They didn't seem to be too impressed with that either. I kept trying to keep a running dialogue for the trip back. All I got was heavy silence or sarcasms. During one of the heavy silences, a phone rang and Carol answered it and put it on speakerphone. I quickly gathered this was the 22-year-old boyfriend, as he kept talking vile comments and suggestions to Carol. She got the phone a little too close to me, and I snatched it and simply tossed it out the window. Carol turned around and saw it bounce 3 or 4 times before it was flattened by an 18-wheeler. She screamed at me that she would buy a new phone. I asked her with whose money and on whose plan. That shut her up. We got to my grandparents, and I could tell that the kids had trouble accepting the unconditional love from their great-grandparents. Grandma kept reminding them of all the happy times the kids had visiting the farm as young children. Out of the blue, Carol smiled and said, "The ducks." Grandma smiled back and said, "That's right, the ducks. You kept calling them your babies, and you had names for them all." Then she turned to my son. "And you, Stephen, you would hop up to go fishing as soon as you got here till it was time to leave." Sensing an opportunity, one asked the kids if they would like to go on the pontoon boat tomorrow as I searched for timber. "Plenty of opportunity to fish or watch for wild ducks," I suggested. The sad reluctance on their faces as they both said no reminded me how this was going to be a long, hard road. It was starting to get late when Stephen mentioned that it might be time to stow away his and Carol's belongings. "Where is your trailer?" he asked, thinking that he and Carol would share the small ratty trailer together with me. "I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint you, Stephen. I bought the old Andrews place and I live in that house now. Gail is there fixing up the rooms for y'all right now." I explained. "Why don't we get started that way? Grandma and Grandpa are coming over for supper, and you're also going to meet Gail's grandfather, Robert Lambert, who is my business partner along with Gail." All I heard on the trip to my house were snide comments about this Gail person, as Stephen mentioned her. I tried to ignore his rudeness. "So, you boinking her," he sneered. I cut a glare at him as I continued to drive. "You remember Carol's lesson earlier when she disrespected your mother? Are you trying for the same thing? Because if you are, I can't accommodate you right here and now on the side of the road," I said coldly. "Both of you better understand right now, Gail is just as worthy of respect as your mother is, and I will not tolerate any rudeness to her." The large ranch came into view, and Carol and Stephen were stunned at the size of the house, along with the adjoining acreage. They became excited seeing the horses roaming in the fields and the large swimming pool in the backyard. Then they remembered they were supposed to be cool, disaffected teenagers and became quiet again. Never had I seen a teenager so predisposed to utterly hate someone as Stephen was as he stepped inside my house with his luggage. Never had I seen a quicker turnaround when Gail walked into view, beamed a smile at him, and gave him a hug. "Hi, Stephen. It is so nice to finally meet you." I thought he was going to melt as it dawned on me that he was love-struck by Gail instantaneously. Well, I couldn't fault him with that. Gail turned to Carol and gave her the same measure of love and attention. Then she led them to their rooms. Large, spacious rooms, complete with computers, TVs, stereos, and private baths. Both Stephen and Carol mentioned the beautiful furniture, and Gail explained the wood was black walnut that we had dredged up in our business operation. An artisan had negotiated building the furniture in exchange for several logs for his own use. It was then that the kids understood why we were doing our operation. It also gave them an understanding how I could afford this large house. Gail had another surprise for Carol. Carol had always wanted a dog, but Stella refused to ever consider it. On Carol's bed was a Labrador Retriever puppy with a red bow on it. As soon as Carol went into the room and saw the eager puppy trying to get to her, she ran to it and scooped it up as the puppy began licking her face. "Oh my God, what is her name?" Carol excitedly asked. "Well, honey, it is your puppy, so you get to name her," I explained. That earned both me and Gail a big hug as she excitedly talked to Stephen about a name. She decided on Pepper after their consultation, and Pepper showed her approval by furiously wagging her little tail and licking Carol's face. As Gail and Carol discussed crate training the puppy, I called Stephen outside to accompany me to the large shop building adjacent to the barn. As I opened the large overhead door, I told him that I hoped he would like it. Inside was a 1964 Ford Mustang in need of refurbishing. I told Stephen that I hoped we could work together on bringing the car back to glory. He just stared there, battling the duality of wanting to hate me and to love me. I just left him there to study his vehicle. We all enjoyed the barbecue out in the backyard. Carol was listening to Grandpa explain how to make Pepper obey commands. Stephen was hovering around Gail, listening closely to her every word and kept trying to impress her. Gail knew what was going on and continued to show him polite deference instead of ridicule. When everyone left, and Gail and I said an early goodnight to Carol, and Stephen as we went to our room, had answered a lot of questions. I saw a hard grimace on Stephen as we left the room. The next day, we spent enrolling them in their new school. That night, I started asking them questions about their day. This was something they had forgotten that I used to do. I insisted on knowing what my kids learned every day, and having been absent for 5 years was not going to be an excuse. Each night they would have to be prepared to let me know what was going on, and we would discuss their lessons. I also told them that I already signed up in the Parents Teachers Association and would soon be meeting with all their teachers to see what I could do to ensure a quality education for both of them. After we ate, I asked Stephen if he wanted to start working on his car. He quickly told me no. I had to chalk it up to his unrequited feelings for Gail. I mentioned it to Gail when we were in bed, and she said she was working on a plan. I told her that I hoped it was a good one. Time marched on. I would cherish my little victories and agonize over my little defeats with my children. Then events occurred that finally shifted the balance. It was time to start baling hay from the fields to provide fodder for the livestock. I kept using a small baler that made rectangular bales weighing around 50 to 60 pounds instead of the large round bales which are in vogue around the country. The problem was the bales would have to be stacked in the barn. That meant it would be necessary to stack the bales on my grandfather's flatbed trailer, transport them to the barn, and offload them. I enlisted Stephen to help me. He and I would load and unload the bales as my grandfather would drive the truck through the field to each bale. What I hadn't counted on was him raiding my stash of beer the night before and being hungover in the morning. When I saw his condition, I just dragged him to the trailer and told my grandpa to start out into the field. I made him haul in the heavy, scratchy bales despite all his protests in the heat of the day. He quickly became sick and threw up the remains of the beer he had drank. He insisted he couldn't do anymore. I threw him a bottle of water to hydrate, and I violated one of my major maxims. So, you going to quit on me, Stephen? You going to quit on me, just like your mother quit on me? Without waiting for any answer, I hopped off the trailer and walked over and lugged the closest bale toward the trailer. Off in the distance, Stephen was walking to another bale to collect. For the rest of the day, he worked like a man possessed. He carried 3 bales to everyone I did, and when the last bale was in the barn, he turned to me, hot, perspiring, dusty, and said, "Go to hell," as he walked to the house to take a shower. That evening, he continued to glare at me as we waited out in the backyard for Gail to arrive so we could start grilling steaks. I was at a perilous brink with Stephen, and I couldn't think of any way to survive the precipice we were perched on. Gail arrived carrying groceries, and to my puzzlement, a passenger was similarly laden with sacks. As they got closer, I was amazed to see a younger version of Gail. They stopped in front of Stephen, and Gail said, "Hi, Stephen. I want you to meet my niece, Betty. She and her family have just moved back here." Stephen was transfixed as he looked at Betty, and I knew the desire he once held for Gail had just transferred to the lovely teenager. "Hi, Stephen. Could you help me carry these sacks?" Before Betty could finish the question, Stephen was on his feet to go to her and relieve her from her burden. As the 3 of them walked toward the house, I could only shake my head at the miracle Gail had produced. All during the grill-out, Stephen and Betty ignored everything else and focused on each other. Stephen asked her what she was doing next weekend. Betty mentioned that her father was having to bale hay next weekend, and she would be busy with that. Stephen immediately volunteered his services, and I told Betty that she couldn't find a better worker than Stephen. Stephen looked at me with gratitude for the compliment I bestowed. "Oh, Stephen, That would be fantastic. We could certainly use the help, and as big and strong as you are, it won't take long to finish that work." She hugged him in appreciation, and I thought, damn, he had gotten it bad for her. I saw Gail looking at me and realized I was no better. There was something about Lambert's women that proved to be kryptonite to Perry's men. They continued to chatter, and then Betty wanted to go look at Stephen's Mustang and begged him for a ride when he had it fixed. That I knew was all the incentive it would take for Stephen to want to refurbish his car. As they left to go look, I held Carol back so Stephen and Betty could have some private time. Later that night in bed, I proclaimed that Gail was a genius, and she insisted I show my gratitude. With the advent of Betty coming into Stephen's life, things became smooth with Stephen. In his desire to please Betty, he transformed into the son I knew had been hiding under the pain and rejection. For Carol, it was a different matter. She kept insisting on her love for her 22-year-old boyfriend. I tried to explain that nature physically rejected that age differential since she had just turned 13. Later in life, when she matured, it wouldn't matter, but now it was morally and legally wrong. My tossing her phone did not stop the communications. Carol wrote to him every chance she got, and Stephen had allowed the use of his phone, at least, until Betty asked him to stop promoting such a creepy relationship. We continued to argue about it until one day a knock on the door brought that sorry scumsucker to my door, announcing he was going to run away with Carol and start their lives. Carol came out of her room with a suitcase, so I knew that this had been planned. I told him to get off my property and not to contact Carol until she was 18. Carol was adamant that she was going with him until Stephen talked some sense into her. I thought we had survived that impasse until late that night I was woken by a large ruckus. I ran into Carol's room in time to see her boyfriend hitting Stephen, knocking him down. Stephen had caught them trying to sneak out of the house and began fighting him. By the time the deputies arrived, the boyfriend had 2 blackened eyes, a broken nose, bloody mouth, and I was rearing back to punt his gonads into his tonsils for the 3rd time before they stopped me. After it all settled down, the sheriff showed Carol some explicit videos on a laptop found in the creep's car. All underage girls performing porno with the creep. That was his livelihood, and Carol had merely been his latest target. That scared Carol into reality and her desire to rush into adulthood. Her creep boyfriend found himself in Huntsville being the love interest of a Crips gangbanger for the next 20 years. The final defining moment was Stephen and Carol both began missing their mother. They asked if it would be possible to spend the Christmas break with her. I told them I had no objection, and they eagerly called to set up the logistics for meeting her. I was informed that the transfer would be at our usual visiting point, and the date and time to meet. I asked Gail and Betty to accompany us because I had a bad feeling for what was about to go down. We got to the spot with time to spare, and Stephen and Carol were eager to see their mother. At the same time, Stephen was saying how he would miss Betty for a whole week and how he planned to make it up to her. As time passed, the kids' enthusiasm began to wane. Stephen started trying to call his mother on his cell phone with no success. After 2 hours, they asked me to drive by the house to let them out. I reluctantly agreed, and we arrived at a nondescript suburban house. Stephen and Carol looked so lonely and vulnerable as they walked up the steps. They rang the doorbell, and soon a surprised Stella answered the door and stepped outside, shutting the door behind her. Though I couldn't hear the conversation, the body language, the animation and agitation brought home what was happening. Stella had hoped the visitation idea would quickly be forgotten in the rush of the holidays. When that hadn't happened, she chose to ignore Stephen's calls. She never expected the kids would be able to convince me to drive them to her house. Now confronted, she had to tell her children they were not welcomed as Carol ran back to the truck, crying to be comforted by Gail. Stephen slowly walked back to the truck, and as he stoically got in, Betty gathered him in her arms as his body began to shake from the silent tears. All I could do was start the painful drive back home. The night had fallen, and the only illumination in the darkened truck was from the instrument panel and the occasional beams of light from oncoming traffic. Nobody spoke until we were about 20 miles from home. This is how you felt. This is how you felt all those times you came to visit, and we didn't show up. All those times we were too busy to be with you. Each month we would break your heart, and you kept coming back to get it broken again. The quiet, barely controlled voice of my son barely held his pain. 1,000 comments were in my throat, and the hurt kept me silent for my response. A new sob came from the back as Carol realized after all this time what I had suffered. Gail continued to hold her. When we got into the house, Gail and Betty left and went into the kitchen so I could talk to my kids. I can't change the past. All I can do is enjoy the present and look forward to the future. God has blessed me with 2 wonderful children, and all I want is for them to live a happy life. I don't want them to be stuck in the past about things they can't change. I want them to be happy, and I want the chance to share their happiness as a family. If I can have that, then I will forever be happy. My speech concluded. The 3 of us engaged in a group hug that continued until Gail and Betty joined. With that, the healing began, and life continued to go on, and our family continued to prosper. Tonight was Stephen's and Betty's high school graduation. Gail, Carol, and I sat along with my grandparents and all the Lamberts clan as a solid block of support for them. I felt such pride as Betty and Stephen walked up to get their diploma, trying to ignore all the cheers coming from our section. Afterwards, they had to pose for all the obligatory photos, and finally we showed them mercy so they could join their classmates in a night-long merriment of celebration. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her going up to Stephen. She hugged him, and he obliged, allowing her without any enthusiasm on his part. She asked a stranger to take a picture of her and her son. The stranger did so, and as she looked at it, Stephen slipped away. She looked up complaining the photo was out of focus and she wanted another shot. She was crestfallen when she saw there were no do-overs tonight. I suspected she had a long list of do-overs. Ted Jefferson had continued his philandering lifestyle until he met up with a gold digger that drained him financially. By the time the succubus had finished with him, he had lost his money, his businesses, and his home. He had tried to confront her, and the boyfriend put him into the hospital. He had to file bankruptcy, and now he and Stella were desperate to make a living. Her children with Ted continued to cause problems at home and at school. The emotional pain and humiliation caused Stella to go on an eating binge, and now she was truly of porcine size. Her entire life ruined, and all she had was an out-of-focus photo with her son. She turned and walked away, disappearing in the crowd. I was gasping as my perspiring body fell against Gail's. We were celebrating Stephen and Betty's graduation in our own private, unique fashion. I heard Gail ask, "How was that?" I continued to try to catch my breath and said, "That was horrible." At my mock response, Gail retaliated with a tickle attack until I told her I gave up. She shifted on top of me and lazily scratched my chest with her fingernails. "Have you given any thought about the Thompsons' farm?" Gail asked about a prospective purchase we had been mulling over. "Yeah, I think we could run cattle on the acreage, but I'd have to see about getting some tags and clearing out all those alligators on that lake. Otherwise, they'd decimate a herd. Oh, honey, we could take the alligator hides and have boots, purses, and belts made for me, my girlfriends, and Betty and Carol for Christmas presents." And as a visual aid, Gail brought her dainty foot up in the air, making several poses. I tried to visualize a naked Gail dressed only in cowgirl boots. What a presentation that would be for Santa. Speaking of Carol, where did she run off to tonight? Well, honey, she is sweet on Tommy Douglas, and she wanted to spend some time with him. He's supposed to come over tomorrow and meet you and ask permission to take Carol on a date. Tommy Douglas, is that Dr. Douglas boy? Yes, dear, and he is already nervous about asking you. So don't scare him off. Gail ordered. Why would he be scared of me? I asked, puzzled. Well, it could be your reputation for beating the hell out of men trying to run off with your daughter. Gail drily responded. Upon reflection, I could only see that as a good thing that would serve well to make sure my daughter would be safe to make up her own mind when it came to that. Still, I gave a mental shudder at what had happened to Gail. I didn't wish that on my daughter or any other woman. I promise you and Carol I'll be on my best behavior. As Gail turned out the light, I thought how there were so many different types of fortunes. You could have a fortune in gold or any other valuable commodity, and what would it ultimately serve you? The voice of Randy Meisner came to me. You can spend all your time making money. You can spend all your love making time. I thought what a sad chase indeed, trying to take it to the limit on that proposition. The only thing I ever found worthwhile taking to the limit was safely ensconced in my arms in my bed and my children living under my roof. I was a wealthy man indeed. Gail whispered in my ear, "Darling, could we do that horrible thing one more time tonight?" She licked my ear as I began to take it to the limit. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.